This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On May the 24th, former Canadian diplomat and Northeast Asia specialist James Trottier, now a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, spoke over Zoom to our Defense and Security Studies evening on the topic, "What is North Korea up to now?" Over to you, Dan and James.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Royal Canadian Military Institute Defense and Security Studies Program speaker event for May 2022. We hope that everyone survived the incredible storm that passed through southern Ontario yesterday and into Quebec with hopefully nothing more than minor destruction. It wasn't minor for lots of people. But we were very lucky where we were, and so we were very, very thankful for that. Tonight, we're very lucky to have with us James Trottier. James reached out to me, I guess, more than a month ago to suggest that the timing was going to be perfect for a presentation on North Korea. And being as involved as I was in the workup to our annual conference, which of course focused on Ukraine, the first thing that came into my mind was, what is North Korea up to now? And so that's exactly what we decided we would title this presentation as, what is North Korea up to now? Because it's too easy to overlook what they have in fact been up to. So for tonight, we're lucky to have James with us. He's one of the leading experts on North Korea. I'm going to give him a more formal introduction momentarily, but he's one of the leading experts on North Korea in Canada. What'll happen essentially is that he has a presentation that will be about 30 minutes long. And at the end of that time, then we'll open up the virtual floor to Q&A. And you can do that in a couple of ways. At the bottom of the screen, you have the Q&A function. So at any time, you can type in a question, and I'll be keeping my eye on those questions, and I'll do my best to have James respond to as many of those as time permits. At the same time, you can also do a raise your hand function, and Tanuja will keep her eye on that, and we'll try to intersperse as many of those as possible as well. So looking forward to this event. And we will get started. So let me just give James a more proper and formal introduction. So James is a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's a lawyer. He's a former career Canadian diplomat with extensive experience in Asia and elsewhere. He headed the political and economic programs at the Canadian embassies in South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines, and was also accredited to Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea, where he led 4 diplomatic missions in 2015 and 16, while concurrently heading political and economic affairs at the Canadian Embassy in Seoul, where he also served as diplomatic liaison to the United Nations and United States forces in South Korea. He served for 4 years as the permanent mission of Canada to the UN in New York, including during Canada's term on the UN Security Council, where he served as the permanent mission's acting legal advisor. At that headquarters, he was responsible for Canada's political relations with the European Union. Now, since leaving the Foreign Service, James has continued to write extensively on North American issues and is considered, as I said earlier, one of Canada's foremost experts on North Korea. And he's regularly invited to participate in expert panels at international conferences on North Korea and is consulted by think tanks, governments, embassies, and the electronic and print media, where he is a regular commentator, including the Globe and Mail, Ottawa Citizen, CTV, CBC TV, CBC Radio, Sirius XM, and other outlets. He's also written on Myanmar, where he served at the Canadian Embassy, political counselor for 5 years, and he met regularly with Aung San Suu Kyi. And by the way, he spoke about the situation in Myanmar several months ago and was quite insightful on what was going on there. He spoke to other opposition figures and the military, and recently established an op-ed on Myanmar in the Globe and Mail in the aftermath of the recent coup. He graduated from Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto and has an MA in Modern History from the University of Toronto. As I mentioned, following James' presentation, we'll have Q&A, and I'll leave it up to you to ask as many wide-ranging questions as you feel so inclined to do so. So with that, James, we welcome you virtually to this platform. We know you're a busy person. You're commentating all over the place, and my goodness, South Korea, or North Korea and South Korea for that matter, today has given you lots of material to work with, I'm sure. So we're looking forward to it and to the Q&A session. And I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Dan, for the invitation and for the kind words, and thanks to all of those who are online. On May the 7th, 2022, North Korea fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile off its east coast. This was notable not only because it was the first submarine launch that year by North Korea, but because it was the 15th North Korean missile test launched in 2022, and the second one in a week. In another year, that launch and the ones that preceded and followed it would have been top news. But in the year of war in Ukraine, inflation, supply chain disruptions, and climate change, North Korean missile tests have flown figuratively under the radar. The news of the 15th missile test launch was contained in one column on page 18 of the Sunday New York Times, beside the 6-column story, plus photographs of President Macron's inauguration for his second term. So what has received much more media and public attention was the announcement by North Korea on May the 12th, 2022, that there had been a COVID outbreak in North Korea, the first time North Korea had acknowledged COVID in the country. So later, I will speak about what this COVID outbreak may mean internally for North Korea, the way in which North Korean leadership is dealing with this crisis, and the extent, if any, it will affect North Korea's foreign and security policy. So the COVID outbreak in North Korea, combined with the inauguration on May the 10th of a new South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, with a harder line towards North Korea, the summit this past weekend between President Biden and President Yoon, and their robust response to North Korea, the ongoing North Korean missile launches, the probability of a 7th North Korean nuclear test in coming days or weeks, and enhanced North Korean cyber activity to evade sanctions, indicates, if not a perfect storm, at least a new phase and a state of flux in the Korean Peninsula and more generally in the region. So this evening, I want to speak about North Korea's ongoing and accelerating missile and nuclear programs, how North Korea finances these programs, how the new South Korean president and the Biden administration plan to deal with North Korea, lessons that may be drawn from the Ukraine invasion, and what all this portends for the foreseeable future, and the impact of the COVID outbreak. So what is the significance of the missile launches that North Korea has conducted in 2022? So in 2022, North Korea this year has undertaken 16 separate missile launch events with a variety of missiles designed to be nuclear capable. Of these launches, only one is known to have been unsuccessful, namely an attempted launch on March 16th of an intercontinental ballistic ICBM Hwasong-17 missile, which is the largest and most powerful missile in North Korea's arsenal. Experts expect that this failed Hwasong-17 missile launch will be repeated until it is successful. But there was a smaller Hwasong-15 ICBM missile, which was successfully launched March 24th and flew higher and longer than any previous North Korean missile. It's this missile that Kim Jong-un had previously claimed could reach North America. That claim has never been verified. So while the West has been understandably preoccupied with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, North Korea has proceeded at an unprecedented pace to test a variety of missiles, cruise and ballistic, long-range ICBMs, intermediate and short-range, land-based and submarine-based missiles. The quality and capability of the missiles tested is also unprecedented. The North Koreans will continue to conduct missile launches, and these will be increasingly bigger and bolder tests. In 2017, North Korea had called a halt to its long-range missile and nuclear tests. Until March of this year, North Korea was very careful not to cross any perceived US red lines regarding resuming long-range missile and nuclear testing. But having crossed one red line in March 2022 with its resumption of ICBM missile testing, experts, including US intelligence, expect North Korea to resume nuclear testing within days, weeks, or months. The nuclear test site reportedly is being prepared close to the border with China. That would be North Korea's 7th nuclear test. The US had anticipated that North Korea might conduct either a missile or a nuclear test or both during President Biden's visit to the region in the past few days. So in response to these tests, the February and March tests, the US said that the tests risked destabilizing the regional security situation. And on March 5th, the US said it had put its forces in a state of enhanced readiness for another test launch. In response to the March 24th ICBM launch, South Korea fired a volley of its own smaller ballistic and air-to-ground missiles to demonstrate, in their words, that South Korea has the capability and readiness to precisely strike missile launch sites, command and support facilities, and other North Korean targets if necessary, according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff. So why is North Korea doing this, and why now? The good news is that North Koreans are not conducting missile tests as a prelude to a preemptive strike. To borrow the comment about Lord Byron being mad, bad, and dangerous to know, the North Korean leadership may be a lot of things, but it is not mad, according to experts on North Korea, including the US intelligence community and the US military, which considers North Korea to be a rational, if troublesome and disturbing actor. As a preemptive attack by North Korea would be met with overwhelming force by the US and South Korea, and end with the total destruction of North Korea as a country and a regime. Such an attack would be the height of madness and contrary to the regime's prime directive, which after all is regime survival. So this doesn't rule out armed conflict involving North Korea, but such a conflict would be inadvertent, with escalation arising from misreading of the other side's intentions. With nuclear armed adversaries, such mistakes could be deadly, hence the need for de-escalation and off-ramps. There are three main reasons for the missile testing. The principal reason is to enhance North Korea's missile and capability and capacity. These upgraded weapon systems need to be continuously tested to ensure they work. A second reason is to strengthen the hand of North Korea in any future negotiations with the US and South Korea. And a third reason is to demonstrate strength and achievement to the North Korean population, which sees few achievements in other areas. Now, the rationale for missile testing applies as well to nuclear testing, hence the expectation of an imminent resumption of nuclear testing. Last year, there had been a fourth reason for the testing, namely to prod the Biden administration to negotiations with some new initiatives other than simple reiteration of the long-time demands for total denuclearization. But it has become apparent to the North Koreans that the Biden administration is not prepared to return to negotiations with a substantially changed negotiation package. Instead, the US has reiterated the existing US policy of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization, CVID. North Korea experts have been warning that unless the US took a proactive approach and was prepared to negotiate about something other than total denuclearization, North Korea would write off negotiations and focus on strengthening its missile and nuclear arsenals. That was the gist of my own remarks to the Canadian International Council, CIC, in 2021 and 2022, and in my June 2021 policy paper for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. In remarks to a ruling party meeting in January of 2022, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un threatened to end the moratorium on nuclear and long-range missile testing in the face of what he perceived as U.S. disinterest in engaging in a meaningful way. To paraphrase, time waits for no nation. Either the U.S. was going to come forward with a new negotiating package, or the North Koreans were going to take matters into their own hands, forcing the U.S. to respond reactively. Unfortunately, it's the latter scenario that's now occurred. North Korea has written off any chance of substantive negotiations in the foreseeable future. Of course, there's no guarantee that a more flexible U.S. position would bring North Korea to negotiations, let alone agreement. However, an inflexible U.S. position made North Korea intransigence inevitable and negotiations very unlikely. It was clear from the beginning of the Biden administration that North Korea was not a top-tier priority. Despite announcing a, quote, practical, calibrated approach to North Korea, unquote, the Biden administration paid little high-level attention to North Korea, falling back on the failed single-track policy of total denuclearization, the same policy that had been unsuccessfully pursued by the George W. Bush administration through Obama's strategic patience approach and Trump's fire and fury and bromance period. They all stuck to total denuclearization. The Biden administration seemed more interested in managing rather than resolving the impasse with North Korea. The U.S. also resisted attempts by the former Moon administration in South Korea to open up other negotiating tracks to North Korea. Now that time has passed, it's very unlikely that there will be any proposals for engagement by the new Yoon administration in South Korea, except in the specific area of COVID. Instead, there will be joint military exercises, robust responses to North Korean provocations, and exchange of heated rhetoric. So last weekend, President Biden visited South Korea and Japan. His visit to East Asia had three main objectives. One was to enhance regional support for the U.S. in its competition with China for predominance in Asia. Two was to strengthen the U.S. alliance with South Korea and Japan, which had been undermined during the Trump administration. And three was to respond robustly to North Korean provocations. In pursuing his wider Asia objective, which has both security and economic dimensions, Biden met in Tokyo with leaders of the so-called Quad, the USA, India, Australia, and Japan, to push back against Chinese assertiveness, including in the South China Sea. Biden also announced his Indo-Pacific Economic Framework with 12 partners, including Australia, Japan, and South Korea, agreeing to participate in negotiations. The framework is meant to help expand U.S. economic leadership in the region and coordinate policies on supply chains, digital trade, infrastructure, clean energy, and other areas. Observers are skeptical of its efficacy. It is not a trade agreement. President Biden did succeed in reaffirming and strengthening the U.S. alliances with the two key U.S. allies in Asia, South Korea and Japan, and setting out a robust position against North Korea. The alliances had been seriously undermined by Trump, who had a very transactional view about them, openly questioning their relevance and undercutting ties in favor of his overtures to North Korea. By contrast, Biden reaffirmed the value of U.S. alliances with South Korea and Japan after his summit with President Yoon of South Korea President Biden said that the alliance between South Korea and the US, quote, has never been stronger, more vibrant, or more vital, unquote. Biden also said that the US and South Korea had agreed on the need for total denuclearization and had agreed to start discussions to expand the scope and scale of their combined military exercises. By contrast, in a gesture to North Korea, Trump had announced a suspension of major military exercises with South Korea without alerting either the government of South Korea or the Pentagon. Biden emphasized the importance of the 28,500 US troops stationed in South Korea. This was a significant change from Trump, who openly questioned why US troops remained in South Korea. Biden also promised to deploy, if needed, strategic assets, which typically include long-range bomber aircraft, submarines, or aircraft carriers, and reaffirmed the US commitment to defend South Korea with nuclear weapons if necessary. Biden said that cooperation between the United States and South Korea showed, quote, our readiness to take on all threats together, unquote. So his efforts to reinforce the alliance with South Korea and deter and defend against North Korean provocations succeeded in strengthening one of the two pillars for security on the Korean Peninsula. But the visit did nothing to deal with the second pillar, namely how to stop North Korea from continuing to enlarge its missile and nuclear arsenals. Successive US administrations have failed to do so. The measures announced by Biden and Yoon will be viewed as hostile by North Korea, reinforce their intention to ramp up their own missile and nuclear capability, and increase the risk of an inadvertent escalation. Pyongyang has defended its nuclear weapons and missile program against what it sees as US threats, and has long described the drills as invasion rehearsals, although the US and South Korea rightly maintain that they are actually defensive. The fact that Biden and Yoon reiterated denuclearization as their primary objective ensures that there will be no negotiations in the foreseeable future. Complete denuclearization is a non-starter for North Korea. The overwhelming view among North Korea experts, including in the US intelligence community and the US military, is that North Korea will never completely denuclearize, as nuclear weapons are its crown jewels and are considered essential for regime survival. Writing in Foreign Affairs, a former senior CIA analyst, Sumi Terry, described North Korea's nuclear weapons as a military asset, an insurance policy, and a vast source of prestige, all in one. So to have denuclearization and only denuclearization reiterated by successive administrations as the key US demand is an exercise in futility and frustration. And without North Korean agreement, there is no way of denuclearizing North Korea short of total war, which is neither realistic nor practical. In testimony before the US Congress in 2017, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified that due to 6,000 to 8,000 underground facilities, it would be impossible to detect and destroy North Korean missile and nuclear facilities short of a large-scale ground invasion, which could have many unintended and unpredictable consequences, including Chinese intervention. A former ambassador to Seoul, former American ambassador to Seoul, said about Biden's discussions in Seoul, quote, it looks to me that the US has defaulted to a posture remarkably similar to the Obama strategic patience policy, and they're getting the same result. No negotiations, more tests, and not even lip service by Pyongyang to the goal of denuclearization. So unfortunately, we are at the beginning of another provocation cycle, which will be marked by North Korean provocations, robust US South Korean responses, a show of force by both sides, heated rhetoric, and no substantive progress on issues of concern. Ultimately, North Korea will emerge from this cycle, as it has from past cycles, with enhanced missile and nuclear capability. The situation of North Korea's main allies is also evolving. The US and South Korea should not expect assistance from China and Russia in reining in North Korea. Neither China nor Russia will support enhancement of sanctions. On the contrary, both will continue to try to ease and undermine existing sanctions. China has long considered North Korea to be awkward company prone to unpredictable behavior. But more recently, China may view North Korea now as more of a strategic asset instead of a liability in China's contest with the USA for predominance in Asia. And as for Russia, North Korea was one of only 4 countries which voted with Russia against the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia for invading Ukraine. North Korea's vote for Russia has given them an IOU with Russia for future consideration. So as I mentioned Ukraine, I'd like to say a few words about the lessons that may be drawn from the Ukraine war by North Korea. So North Korea, like other countries, will have been paying close attention to that war. And it may draw some contradictory lessons from the war, 2 which favor its interest and 3 which run counter. The first one on which North Korea needed no convincing is the consequence of giving up nuclear weapons like Ukraine did. For North Korea, regime security is the #1 priority, the prime directive, and nuclear weapons are considered essential for regime survival. So Ukraine's experience just reinforces the point. The second lesson is how the threat of using nuclear weapons can be used as a threat and a deterrent to try to prevent potential adversaries from escalating or intervening in the face of provocations and actual invasion. The third lesson is that the fierceness and skill of the Ukraine resistance has demonstrated what a motivated, well-trained, and well-equipped military can do to push back an aggressor. The fourth lesson may be the importance of witnessing the resolve of the USA and its allies to defend its friends. In the case of South Korea and Japan, it would not only be US weapons and money provided to them if they were attacked, but US boots on the ground, planes and missiles in the air, and ships at sea. North Korea should have no illusions about this. The fifth lesson and final lesson may be a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences if North Korea was to get into a major conflict with South Korea. The Ukraine war demonstrates categorically the death and destruction that will result in both countries in the event of the exchange of missiles. For North Korea, the result at best would be a return to the status quo, and at worst, defeat and regime annihilation. To the casual observer, there may be a disconnect between North Korea's ability to launch sophisticated missiles and conduct nuclear tests and its existence as one of the poorest and most sanctioned states in the world. So how does North Korea support its expensive missile and nuclear programs? Mainly by evading sanctions. The UN Security Council panel of experts on North Korea outlines in its report the ingenious ways that North Korea circumvents sanctions. Sanctions evasion includes North Korea's successful venture into cyber hacking, bank and wire fraud, cryptocurrency theft, cryptocurrency mining. Cyber and crypto activities have proven particularly lucrative to North Korea. The UN experts panel has referred to North Korea's theft of $316 million of virtual assets from 2019 to November 2020. 2021 was even more profitable for North Korea. In fact, it was the most lucrative year yet for crypto theft, with the biggest known single heist reported by the UN experts believed to have gained 400 to 600 million worth of cryptocurrency hacked from a video game company. In April 2022, US authorities highlighted the threat posed by cryptocurrency thefts and tactics used by the North Korean state-sponsored Lazarus Group. And in May 2022, the US Treasury linked the Lazarus Group to, quote, the high-profile theft of $625 million worth of cryptocurrency in March 2022 from the Ronin Bridge linked to the popular play-to-earn game Axie Infinity, unquote. To put a little context to this, the leading states involved in illicit cyber activity are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The difference between North Korea and these other states is that the others normally use illicit cyber activity for espionage and sabotage for state purposes. Well, North Korea is active in crime for profit activities as well as for state purposes. Much remains unknown about North Korean cyber activity, including the command structure. In fact, a US government report indicated that North Korean intelligence may actually spread misinformation to its own operatives regarding cyber activities to create smokescreens in case of defection. Much of what we do know comes from US agencies and the UN experts group, as well as experts such as Harvard University's Priscilla Moriuchi, who is considered one of the world's leading authorities on North Korea's cyber activities. She served for 12 years at the National Security Agency, where she was the enduring threat manager and top subject matter expert on East Asia and Pacific cyber threats. Moriuchi has described North Korea's embrace of criminality as unique and has likened North Korea to, quote, an international crime syndicate supported by the state, unquote. According to her, North Korea cyber activities tend to be decentralized and operate under general guidelines rather than be centrally directed. Most North Korean operations abroad are self-sustaining. They have to pay for themselves. North Korea has succeeded at combining state and criminal activities with embassies as operational hubs of activity. Over the years, North Korean embassies have engaged in a wide range of activities, including trading and smuggling in alcohol, cars, gems, oil, etc. They've also been involved in legal activity to raise revenue. The North Korean embassy in Germany, for example, ran a youth hostel for backpackers. Few, if any, of the backpackers knew they were in a North Korean facility. There was also an extensive array of North Korean restaurants abroad. But as far as cyber, experts say that North Korea runs many cyber operations out of China, where critical infrastructure is located, including platforms, servers, and computers. Moriuchi and other experts say that it's unsurprising that North Korean hackers should come into close contact with the criminal underworld, and specifically, but not exclusively, with the Russian criminal underworld. North Korea hackers can buy from the Russian criminal underworld, one, malware and software, or malware and ransomware. Two, access to networks, including those involving banks, defense industry, etc. Three, money laundering facilities. And four, platforms for sale of data, such as credit card information. North Korea hackers actually have the expertise to produce their own cyber tools and have done so, but to cover their tracks, there's a big advantage in buying off-the-shelf criminal tools, and the Russian connection gives North Korea more options. North Korean activities are becoming increasingly sophisticated. While they still attack organizations with poor security, the US government in April 2022 said that North Korea's cyber activities actors have targeted a wide range of crypto and blockchain companies, including cryptocurrency exchanges, decentralized protocols, play-to-earn cryptocurrency video games, cryptocurrency trading companies, venture capital funds investing in cryptocurrency, and individual holders of large amounts of cryptocurrency or valuable non-fungible tokens. The most recent UN experts report said that cyber attacks made use of phishing lures, code exploits, malware, and advanced social engineering to siphon funds out of organizations interconnected hot wallets into DPRK controlled addresses. Experts expect that the criminal activity by North Korea will continue to increase for the foreseeable future. It will likely get easier in the future to convert cryptocurrency to fiat, to hard currency, without the need for North Korea to go through several transactions to cover its trails. An additional issue is the extent to which crypto will be able to be used in the future directly for payments for oil, gas, coal, etc., precluding the need for acquisition of fiat currencies. So in Seoul this past weekend, President Biden said that his administration would collaborate to confront cyber attacks from North Korea. That is important, as many North Korea cyber ops are first tested in North Korea before being released more widely. For example, ATM malware was pioneered in South Korea by North Korea. An interesting twist to all this is that North Koreans also raise capital by doing regular IT work while posing as nationals of other countries, according to a report on May 16, 2022, from 3 US government agencies. Now, a lot of these IT projects involve digital currency. And according to the report, quote, some DPRK, that is North Korea IT workers, have designed virtual currency exchanges or created analytical tools and applications for virtual traders and marketed their products themselves, unquote. The agencies also said that while many of these IT workers do normal IT work, they have used the privileged access gained as contractors to enable the DPRK's malicious cyber intrusions. So this is one area where it really is buyer beware. So what next? Expect several years of rising tension with enhanced North Korea testing, robust responses to North Korean provocations, North Korean missile and nuclear tests, and displays of US power, US-South Korean military exercises, and exchange of threats and warnings. In the short term, what will be needed are voices of restraint to ensure that the rhetoric, threats, and counter-threats do not spiral out of control. Neither side may actually intend to start a conflict, but there is always the danger of miscalculation and overreaction from one side or the other. That's why it's important to avoid an escalating spiral of provocations and threats and find an off-ramp from that spiral. One way to exit this armed standoff would be if the US is willing to take a different approach to North Korea, and if North Korea is willing to consider such a new approach. I do not expect this will occur in the foreseeable future. A new approach would be one that is not totally focused on denuclearization, but also looks at containment, arms control, and weapons reduction, as well as areas of possible engagement. The degree to which North Korea may be prepared to freeze nuclear and missile development, uranium enrichment activity, and testing of new weapons, and even eliminate parts of its existing stockpile in return for the right terms, notably significant easing and or elimination of sanctions, should be explored. So what about the impact, the possible impact of the COVID outbreak in North Korea? The initial acknowledgement on May the 12th by North Korea of a COVID outbreak was followed on May 14th by a report in North Korean state media that leader Kim Jong-un had called the COVID outbreak a great disaster, and had said, quote, the spread of malignant epidemic is the greatest turmoil to fall on our country since the beginning, unquote. That is quite a statement, since the period referred to includes the Korean War and the devastating Great Famine of the 1990s. State media then went on to say that there had been 500,000 cases of unexplained fever in recent weeks, and that 27 people had died since April after suffering a fever. After that, North Korea raised the figure to 1.5 million people infected with fever and 56 dead, and then to 2 million people infected and 100 dead. Most recently, North Korean media has been reporting 200,000 new infections a day. The actual death count is likely to be much higher than reported, and both the number of dead and infected are likely to grow exponentially. North Korea has announced the various remedial measures, including severe lockdowns and isolation. During the pandemic, North Korea has been very concerned about COVID, understandably so, given its ramshackle health system, which I saw during my several official visits to North Korea, and its lack of vaccines. In the past, North Korea had refused vaccines from China, South Korea, and the UN COVAX vaccine sharing program for various reasons. It refused because of its extreme suspicion about outsiders and concerns about any conditions that would be attached, including about distribution, monitoring, and influx of foreigners. Instead, for 2 years, North Korea had undertaken draconian measures of locking down all its borders to people and trade. This had halted virtually all trade and had had a bigger impact on the economy and people's livelihoods than sanctions. That the actual success at blocking COVID has been unknown. There are always suspicions that COVID was present to some extent in North Korea, but there have been no confirmation of that until now. The fact that North Korea has now acknowledged some cases and announced measures inside North Korea indicates that the outbreak is very likely to be much greater than the numbers they have acknowledged. It has the potential to be a massive humanitarian disaster. It may be in announcing the outbreak, the regime is trying to get out in front of the problem, show the population it has things under control, and prepare people for the tough days ahead, including food shortages and malnutrition. The regime may also be signaling to the international community its need for vaccines and other humanitarian assistance. The fact that it has not acknowledged offers of assistance from the US and South Korea is not surprising given their history and relations. And North Korea reportedly does not trust the Chinese vaccine. North Korea wants mRNA vaccines, Pfizer or Moderna, delivered via the UN COVAX programs in numbers sufficient to vaccinate the entire population in the order of 40 to 60 million doses rather than the 4 million that COVAX had initially offered. Whether the resources and requirements of COVAX regarding the volume, delivery, and monitoring can be squared with North Korea's demands and obsession with secrecy and security remains to be seen. But North Korea does have long-standing relationships with WHO, UNICEF, and other UN agencies. When I traveled to Pyongyang, there were 6 UN agencies operating in North Korea at the time, fewer now. Whatever happens with COVID, this will not loosen the regime's grip on its population, just as the arduous march of the 1990s, when hundreds of thousands died of famine and malnutrition, strengthened rather than weakened the regime's grip on power. Nor will it cause North Korea to deviate from the path it has chosen in foreign policy and missile and nuclear development. On May 13th, the day after the initial acknowledgement of the existence of COVID in North Korea launched 3 short-range ballistic missiles into the water between the Korean Peninsula and Japan. The acknowledgement of COVID and the possible acceptance of vaccines from abroad, if that happens, could possibly be a change of tactics by North Korea, but it is not a change of strategy. At best, Kim Jong-un may be signaling a change of lanes, but he is not changing direction. Thank you.
James, thank you so much for that. You've covered a lot of ground very quickly, and at least a couple of the questions I have, and at least one of the questions in the Q&A you answered quite thoroughly. Let me raise it from a different point of view. So the question really focused on how North Korea finances its high-tech programs, which would include obviously the nuclear program, but presumably the cyber. I'm kind of curious about how they they generate the expertise. I mean, they've been at this for quite a while. They must have a high level or high number of people who have expertise in nuclear physics, in cyber, obviously computing. How do they do that? Are these people traveling to other parts of the world and gaining education and coming back? Or does North Korea have a very sophisticated educational system that somehow continues to generate the level of expertise that would be needed to maintain these programs? Curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so they actually have a high level of universities in part. So they have a hierarchy of universities in the same way that South Korea has a hierarchy of universities, and they have top scientists who have been trained at the university and train other people at the university. They've also had people over the years training, doing studies in China and in Russia, but they have their own sort of ecosystem of universities. People, I think, are surprised to hear in regards to universities. But for instance, we have a program at UBC, which is in suspension now because of the pandemic. But it brings in half a dozen scholars for 6 months at a time from North Korea. You know, and they're selected by the person who runs the program on the basis of their academic performance and their academic expertise in economics or whatever it happens to be, and then they're usually chosen at assistant professor level at North Korean universities, and when they've tracked their progress on returning, they usually get a promotion to associate level professor. So but that, I'm just giving that as an example of this kind of whole ecosystem of academia which exists there.
Okay. Another question that came up had to do with this evident sort of dichotomy of thinking on the denuclearization issue between the U.S. intelligence community and the actual political administration. So the political administration, you know, is taking a position that there's not going to be any kind of negotiations unless there is this hard denuclearization program undertaken. And yet you've indicated some places where there could be some useful dialogue and useful negotiation. Do you think there really is a split or a gap between the U.S. intelligence community and the political administration, or are they just looking at this situation from totally different perspectives?
Well, I think at the political level, they're looking at it from a political perspective, and it would be impossible for an American administration to renounce denuclearization. They would. It's an article of faith that has to be proclaimed. What I'm saying is that it's futile, and it's a non-starter to only have that as the holy grail, as the mantra. That what I suggest, and what other people have suggested, is that there be parallel tracks, so that we're not renouncing denuclearization, have it as kind of an ultimate goal, if you will, but that should not, the lack of progress on the new denuclearization track should not stop us from pursuing another track, which includes conventional arms negotiation, arms reduction, discussions about limitation of the stockpile, discussions about freezing of uranium enrichment activities, and so on. So, in other words, let's not hold out the best to stop us from getting some moderate progress.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
But I think from just to go back to your original point, I think that in their heart of hearts, successive administration figures at the political level or at the diplomatic level know what the reality of denuclearization as a non-starter is, but they're also aware of the political sensitivities around this question. So that's why I say we're not renouncing denuclearization as a goal, but pursue a second track. And eventually it will come around, eventually it will come around to that, because eventually, as it has in South Korea, you have administrations which take a hard line and don't want to negotiate, and then they're succeeded by other ones who do want to negotiate, and so on and so forth. So,
right. So, in terms of Russia and Ukraine, there's been a counter argument that if you take a look at Russia's perspective, then the move eastward of NATO towards, the Russian flank is a provocation, and that there was really a lack of understanding of Russia's sense of security priorities. I don't know whether that's an exact parallel, probably isn't in terms of North Korea, but you talk a lot about provocations and the possibility for escalation based on miscalculations. So to the extent that, the United States and South Korea, for example, have announced that they want to restart significant military joint exercises, why wouldn't North Korea see that as a possible provocation? And is that a good idea?
Well, that's why I say that there are two pillars to this, and two pillars to President Biden's discussions in South Korea. One was the need, which is a genuine need, to reaffirm the value of the alliances and bolster the alliance, and tell the South Koreans, reassure them that the U.S. had their back. So that's one of the pillars. But the second pillar was, how do you stop North Korea from ramping up their missile and nuclear program? And unfortunately, the way this kind of equation goes, strengthening the first pillar tends to undermine the second pillar, because the North Koreans will do exactly as you say. They take the reaffirmation of the troops in South Korea, the military exercises, the movement of strategic assets, the nuclear umbrella, all as sort of prep for an invasion. And then that causes them to ramp up their missile and nuclear preparation, which in turn causes unease and concern among the South Koreans and Americans, which cause them to ramp up their preparation. So that's why I say about a provocation cycle, which has, this is the, there have been several provocation cycles, but the one thing which is consistent in these cycles is that South Korea emerges from each of them with a stronger capacity in missile and nuclear. So somehow one has to find a way to sort of shift the paradigm to break that cycle. And that's why, people have said, and experts are looking at this, will say that you have to find, it's the stick. So Biden's trip was very good for the stick, but where are the carrots? There are no carrots on this, on this trip. There's just the stick, and unfortunately, the stick leads to a bigger stick by the North Koreans, which then in turn encourages even a bigger stick on the part, and then you go to this whole issue of escalation and miscalculation and so on. So
Thank you. Eric, you have your hand up. Please go ahead and ask a question.
Yeah, I was very interested in your mentioning that the North Korean underworld, if you want to call it that, is very closely connected with the Russian underworld. Since I do Russia, do you think that the current war in Ukraine and the sanctions, in particular against Russia, is going to strengthen that gray to black connection between Russia and North Korea? And if so, what do you think it might look like?
yeah, I should clarify that on the Russian side, these are the criminal underworld that North Korean operatives are dealing with.
Yeah.
On the North Korean side, this isn't a criminal underworld. These are state operatives who are pursuing kind of a dual track. On the one hand, they pursue state objectives, the traditional state objectives that might use cyber. On the other hand, they are crime for profit operation. So they're the ones who are dealing with the criminal underworld. They seem to be, for instance, they seem to be, as we say, fully operational. When I cited these cases that I mentioned, the Lazarus group, for instance, these were cases that happened in March and April of this year. So this is during the Ukraine war. I expect that, as with most things, because of the war, things will probably become more expensive for North Korean operatives and North Korea in dealing with these sort of Russian suppliers. But the supply will continue. I also might mention, as I mentioned about the laundering facilities, the Russian criminal mafia takes a fair percentage, quite a significant percentage, of North Korean ill-gotten gains as a price, as a commission for laundering this money, because there are several layers of laundering that occur. And so I would expect that will continue, but it will just continue to get more expensive.
Yeah, the interesting thing, of course, about the Russian underworld is that it is an arm's length relationship with the Kremlin, but you never know how long the arm is. So I could imagine a lot of that rake-off going back into the SVR or the FSB coffers.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is discussed. I mean, the relationship of the Russian state with the Russian underworld and the awareness of the Russian state, and for that matter, the Chinese state. The expectation is that China turns a blind eye to these platforms and networks and cyber activities that operate out of China by North Koreans, a blind eye that it wouldn't turn if they were in fact Chinese nationals doing this. But there seems to be they're aware that this is going on, and they allow it to continue. And I think that in the North Korean Russian connection, one would expect that the Russian state, or these elements, agencies of the Russian state, are aware of this activity. And as you say, beyond awareness, possibly a sharing of the benefits of the activity.
One follow-on question, if I may, and I'm being only slightly absurd here, but in the past 3 months, the Russian armed forces have been proven to be operating without shorts, basically. Do you think this is going to give other authoritarian nations a bad name? I mean, how many of those missiles can North Korea actually have besides the ones they're firing at the moment?
Well, it's not so much the missiles. I mean, it is the missiles, but it's the nuclear warheads. I mean, the expectation is that they have upwards of 60 nuclear warheads and have the capacity to produce, say, 6, every several months. Beyond that, in regards to the missiles, yeah, they obviously have there's not an indefinite stock, but they do have more than they're actually test firing. I mean, the test firing is to test the capacity and the capability. And the other thing is that they have these warheads, or the warheads and the missiles are buried in underground facilities. I mentioned 6,000 to 8,000, which also have conventional weapons in. So there are a lot of unknowns in this situation, including the capacity at the moment of North Korea to attach the warheads to the actual missiles. That's something which is in a gray area as well at the moment.
It reminds me of an old Soviet joke. Two Russians are talking to each other. One says, "Realize that we have now produced enough nuclear warheads that our agents can carry them to every Western capital in a suitcase?" Second one says, "Well, I'm pretty sure about the warheads, but would we have enough suitcases?"
Yeah, and
the Russians are showing that thing out of technology on the battlefield.
Yeah, and I think that was one of my points that I made about one of the lessons from the Ukraine war for a country like North Korea. I mean, they will be seeing what the Russian army and the Russian technology vis-a-vis a well-equipped, well-trained, disciplined, and inspired military can do. And so that will certainly give them pause, because I mean, the North Korean army is basically made up of conscripts. The North Korean military have an asymmetrical force, so they're very good at missile technology, special forces, and a few other sectors, but in a lot of ways, the overall military resembles the Russian army, but the Russian army of perhaps pre-World War I, kind of the Tsarist army of conscripts.
Okay, thanks, Eric. So just a couple more questions for you, James, before we start to sign off. It's after 8 o'clock. You've mentioned the Quad, which is sort of a new development in terms of the relationships there in East Asia, including the United States. Do you think that South Korea would be wise to try to join the Quad formally, or would that make any difference at all in terms of their defensive security posture?
I think the emphasis right now by the Americans with South Korea and Japan is to ensure that Japan and Korea work together in a collaborative fashion at multiple levels, both military and otherwise. And I know that new President Yoon in South Korea has expressed interest in warming up the relations with Japan. So that's certainly I think the emphasis from the American side would be reinforcing not only their alliance with both those countries, but the relationships. They're trying to build the relationship between Japan and South Korea.
Okay. All right. Let me then end with one last question. I won't make it into a commentary, but so the impression I get is that regardless of the extent of the damage that might be caused by COVID-19 in North Korea, this has no potential to change any kind of strategic posture, that regardless of how many million people die, and regardless of offers of support from the United States or other places, Kim will not change his fundamental views. Is there any potential counter argument to that from your perspective?
Well, the only, I mean, just to reiterate what you said, I think that is the situation, that Kim may or may not accept the vaccines from abroad, from COVAX. They may or may not be enough for the North Korean population. There'll be a lot of, it'll be a tragic situation. A lot of people will be infected. A lot of people will die. But the means of control in North Korea are so pervasive that I don't see that changing the control over the regime's control over the country, and certainly for Kim, he will try to do these things in parallel. He will deal with the situation internally in whatever way he chooses, while he maintains the program, the missile and nuclear testing program. And I would be very surprised, for example, and I think other North Korean experts would be very surprised if there was no 7th nuclear test this year. In fact, it will probably be sooner rather than later. And then I think one of the dilemmas for the outside world will be some will find it awkward to be asked for humanitarian assistance at the same time as there is a nuclear test going on. But one should not make the people of North Korea pay for the acts of their government, of which they have no choice.
Right. That's really a good point, and a good point to end on. It's sad to think of how much damage and destruction this is going to potentially cause the everyday people of North Korea. And of course, we know now, having lived through it, the whole business of testing and tracing, and if you don't have enough vaccines and the ability to distribute those vaccines and so on, whether their system could even successfully do that, even if they were given the number of vaccines that they want or need. So it's going to be really something to watch, and I'm sure you're going to be keeping an eye on it for us. So thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and James, for taking the time to come and talk to us tonight. I mean, your insights and your level of expertise are obviously on display. There's lots of things going on in the world other than what's happening in Ukraine, and it's so important for us to ensure we don't lose track of those things, because I've been laying awake at night thinking about what are the Russian options, and I guess one of the Russian options is to try to take advantage of things happening in other parts of the world, whether that's China invading Taiwan or North Korea, continuing to test nuclear weapons. All these things start to become interrelated. Even if they're not formal allies, they have a common enemy, which is seen as the United States and the West. So, to be able to take advantage of somebody else's situation to further your own, even though you're not in formal alliance, is something that I have no doubt that these folks would try to leverage if they were given the opportunity. So it's been a great presentation, and we've learned a great deal. So thanks again for coming, James. Our thanks to you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in the future.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.